Speaking of protests and freedom and democracy, there's been another sign of Beijing tightening its grip in Hong Kong, with its annual vigil commemorating the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre called off for the first time in 30 years. Of course, June the 4th, later this week, is the anniversary, and the authorities are using the excuse of the coronavirus pandemic for the ban. The anniversary marks the massacre, of course, of thousands of people when the People's Liberation Army cleared those peaceful protests from the heart of China's capital city back in 1989. It was the Hong Kong police who have banned this week's commemoration, just a week after China's vote to impose strict national security legislation on the former colony. Many nations, including Australia, have condemned those laws and the apparent undermining of Hong Kong's autonomy. Let's cross now live to Mike Bird from the Wall Street Journal, who's in Hong Kong. Thanks for joining us, Mike. With these bans on the commemoration of Tiananmen Square, do you expect that they'll be respected, or do you expect that some people in Hong Kong will try and get out on the streets or commemorate it in some way?
Well, the organisers of the vigil have called for people to light a candle to hold their own vigil wherever they can, particularly on the streets outside of Victoria Park, where the the vigil was initially scheduled to be held and where it's been held for the last 30 years. So there will definitely be some commemoration. How many people will actually gather in Victoria Park remains to be seen.
And I suppose how authorities or how the police treat them will be a big question as well.
Absolutely. I mean, this year's has been cancelled because of the coronavirus. The social distancing rules in Hong Kong, which had a relatively light experience with coronavirus compared to a lot of countries in Europe and North America, still in place, which means you can't have this sort of gathering. But the national security law, which, as you mentioned, has been brought in by the NPC in Beijing, will mean that it's fairly unlikely that this will be held again once that comes into force. Yeah,
that's the point here. Of course, the ban has been put in place by the Hong Kong police. The coronavirus is the reason that they're giving. But do you believe that this is a sign of Beijing increasing its control on the autonomy of Hong Kong?
I think certainly some people have expressed some scepticism. The social distancing rules that require groups of no larger than 8 is put in place until midnight on June the 4th. So it expires technically on the night that the vigil would have been held. There's certainly some people have expressed scepticism about the timing of that. And certainly you've seen with the protest movement that far fewer events are actually getting permission to proceed, far fewer of the large-scale marches that you saw last year. The police tactics in terms of arresting people this year have been much more aggressive, far more people arrested before they can meaningfully congregate. Of course, the vigil isn't technically a protest movement, but it's the only commemoration of the Tiananmen massacre held within a Chinese territory. So it is seen as a sort of symbol of that sort of civil resistance and the civic rights that Hong Kong has that aren't present in the rest of mainland China.
Yeah, from this distance and with an eye to history, you could imagine, could you not, that if the vigil doesn't occur this year, it would never recur again, coronavirus or not?
I think that's it. We don't know the details of what will be in the national security law yet. The draft bill hasn't been published, but we do know that it will include elements about sedition, for example, about criticism of the Chinese state, which make it quite difficult to imagine this happening in the same way in the future. Yeah.
Now, the US is starting to talk about restricting some of the trade advantages that Hong Kong is given as a protest against these crackdowns on autonomy. Other countries like Australia have just said things, made diplomatic overtures, disagree with what Beijing has done. Is there any evidence that Beijing is taking any notice, and what are the people of Hong Kong feeling? Do they feel that they can resist this authority coming from Beijing, or do they feel resigned to being subsumed by it?
I don't think people here generally feel resigned, although the government has made it clear here that whatever people's opinions are about the draft bill, it will simply not change the process. This is being brought in by Beijing. It was a part of Hong Kong's basic law negotiated between China and the United Kingdom at the time of the handover and before then, that Hong Kong would have to bring this into effect. It would have to bring in a national security law. Effectively, Beijing has decided this year, to some extent, very likely because the rest of the world's rather preoccupied with the pandemic response, that they're not going to allow that to take place domestically. There were going to be elections in September to the LegCo, Hong Kong's legislative body. They're not going to allow the LegCo to process this law on its own. It tried to do that in 2003, which sparked mass protests of the same sort that you saw last year. Basically, because Beijing has decided this independently, I think it does really mark a sort of step change. It's the first occasion where the central government of mainland China has decided to intervene in this way and to not allow the Hong Kong government to proceed with this itself. So I think people are taking it very, very seriously. And I think the fact that it seems very unlikely that the protest movement you saw last year will be allowed to resume in any meaningful way does make things somewhat more bleak politically.
Indeed. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.